is belief in a God logical? Does holding the position of there being a God make sense? Let's open that door. So as I'm scrolling through social media, one of the most obvious points atheists make is how illogical and dumb people look who still hold the view of there being a God in today's time. They jump to the classical line of how it cannot be proven scientifically. Now, most of the time, conversations lead to how it is grounded in an age-old belief that a couple of people came up with to control people. Then this question came to me. Just because one person does not agree with the position that someone else holds, is that enough to discredit the reasonability of that stance? Is that enough to deem something illogical without considering the reasons someone has for their stance? So let's take a look at how this played out in history. 1916, we have Albert Einstein formulating calculations which were leading him to a place that could possibly show the universe was not eternal. Therefore, up to this point, it was assumed and considered logical to think the universe was eternal. Einstein is later quoted to call this discovery, general relativity, irritating, because he did not like the fact that it could mean the universe was not self-existent, which in turn would mean it was reliant on an outside cause. 1919, British cosmologist Arthur Eddington conducted an experiment during a solar eclipse which confirmed that general relativity was indeed true. The universe wasn't static, but rather that it had a beginning. 1929, Einstein went to Mount Wilson to look through the Hubble telescope to finally see for himself that observational evidence showed that the universe was indeed expanding as general relativity predicted. Now, although Einstein said that he believed in a pantheistic God, his comments admitting creation and divine thought better described a theistic God. This whole section is listed in Geisler and Turek's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, which I highly recommend. What's the point of the story? Well, throughout this time, there were a couple of positions presented with opposing views. It was thought the universe was eternal, which was a position many agreed with. Then Einstein brought general relativity, and an opposing view came forward. It did not automatically mean the reasoning for the eternal view was now unreasonable to hold. There was simply another option for whether our universe had a beginning. When presented with this situation, imagine the one party thinking the other party with the opposing view was illogical or dumb. The person thinking this would actually be the unreasonable one. To this day, there are still those who hold the position that the universe had no beginning. An example would be Stephen Hawking himself. In 1983, Hawking and Hartle proposed the cosmos may have had no temporal beginning at all, but rather a rounded off cap of pure space. Now, their position rejected the singularity scenario of the Big Bang. Hawking held this position until prior to his death, as he admitted to in 2016 at a lecture at the Pontifical Academy. This example shows us that, till this day, we have scientific opposing views on the topic of our cosmos being eternal or not. Does this therefore mean it is reasonable and logical to call the opposing view illogical or unreasonable? Well, no. Does anyone know for sure? No. But do these positions have good reasons for why they hold their positions in the first place? Yes. Now let's turn our attention to those who hold the belief in a God, and whether or not it has any grounds to stand on. Now, just to clarify, I personally am a Christian, but this video is not intended to prove that Christian God is the one true God. That's a different video. Instead, I'm talking about whether having a belief in a God is a reasonable stance and a logical stance to have. This video is not intended to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that God exists, but rather that the belief in God's existence is a valid hypothesis to hold. Let's take a look at some premises that could lead us to possibly conclude that a belief in a divine God makes sense. Number 1, the Kalam cosmological argument. In its simplest form, it states that whatever begins to exist has a cause, like this table. The universe has a beginning, the Big Bang, if you hold that stance. And then 3, therefore it must have a cause. Does this mean therefore God? No, but let's keep listening. The second premise is the teleological argument. In its most basic form, it states that every design has a designer. The universe has complex design, therefore it has a designer. Alright, the third premise is the moral argument. In its basic form, it holds the position that there is a universal objective moral standard that is required to measure all things good or bad. Without an objective moral standard beyond ourselves that we are measuring good or bad to, universal morality does not exist. Once morality is deemed subjective, it collapses in on itself, just like subjective truth would collapse in on itself. Raping babies is always wrong. Once subjective morality is imposed, then it can be right to rape babies because my neighbor thought so. My neighbor thought it's good to do this, and therefore it just demonstrates just like that it collapses in on itself. The fourth premise is grounded in the characteristics that we can deduce from what a beginner would have based on Big Bang cosmology, as referred to in the first premise. We can conclude that since space, time, and matter came into existence at the Big Bang, the cause of this cannot be within space, time, or matter, since they did not exist in the first place. Therefore, the cause or beginner would have to be timeless to create time, spaceless to create space, and immaterial to create matter. We can also conclude that since there is so much energy in our universe, that the cause of our universe has to be extremely powerful. Finally, the cause or beginner has to be personal, meaning able to make decisions, since impersonal forces like a rock cannot make decisions to, say, cause the universe. Can I delve into each of these arguments more? Yes, and those are in other videos on my channel, as I look at classical objections to these arguments and responses to those objections. But for the intention of this video, we can therefore think that it is a reasonable and logical stance to hold a belief in a God. A beginning requires a beginner. A design requires a designer. Moral law requires a moral law giver. Now, the most asked question out of these arguments are, but who created God? This question assumes God had a beginning. In the chain of causes and effects, which is the law of causality, it all comes down to the eternal uncaused first cause. The cause that always was, that was uncaused, the infinite state that brought about our finite state. Therefore, I would argue that holding a belief in a God is a reasonable and logical belief. I would go as far as to say that those who end up saying we don't know what caused our universe and end there with their thinking are intellectually lazy. Just because someone holds an opposing view with supported and good premises to yourself does not make their view illogical or unreasonable. It rather makes you unreasonable and intolerant of those who differ from you.